My son said dinner had been canceled, but when I got there, I found them eating without me. That single moment shattered something inside me, more than just my appetite or my evening. It felt like the ground gave way beneath my feet, and years of sacrifice, love, and patience collapsed into a silence that rang louder than any scream. I had always believed that my family, no matter how distant or distracted they became, would never cut me out like I was nothing. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. Yet there I stood outside my own home, watching through the kitchen window as the people I had built my life around laughed and shared a meal without me. The night had started ordinarily. My son called me, his voice curt and dismissive, telling me not to bother coming down because dinner was canceled. He said they had changed plans, that everyone was too busy or too tired. I remember sitting in my chair for a long while after hanging up, my hand heavy with the phone still clutched in it. Something didn't feel right. My instincts, sharpened over years of being brushed aside and spoken over, told me there was more to it. And though my chest ached, though part of me dreaded what I might find, I rose and walked down the hallway, the same hallway I had walked 1,000 times before, the walls lined with family pictures that had long since stopped being updated. When I reached the kitchen doorway, I froze. The sound hit me first. Laughter, the clinking of glasses, forks scraping against plates. For a moment, I thought I was imagining it, that my mind was playing a cruel trick on me. But then I saw it, the table I had built with my own hands, polished by years of family gatherings, now crowded with faces I recognized all too well. My wife, my son, my daughter-in-law, even the grandchildren. They were all there, heads bent close, food piled high, smiles wide. My chair was missing, not pulled out for me, not saved. It was tucked away in the corner like I had never been expected in the first place. I can't describe the sensation that washed over me. It wasn't just hurt, it was humiliation, sharp and raw, cutting into me like broken glass. My son had looked me in the eye earlier that day, told me dinner was canceled, and here he was, grinning with a mouth full of roast and red wine, as if I were a ghost already buried. My own blood had lied to me, deliberately, with no hesitation. What was I to them now? A burden? An afterthought? Or worse, something to be discarded, forgotten, erased from the picture of their lives? I stood there longer than I should have, my breath shallow, my body rigid. Part of me expected someone to notice, to look up, to see me standing there and wave me in with a guilty smile, some flimsy excuse about a misunderstanding. But no one looked. No one cared. They were too caught up in each other, in the feast, in the comfort of excluding me. Memories began to flood my mind, unbidden and merciless. Birthdays where I had stayed up all night building toys. College tuition bills I had worked double shifts to cover. The roof over their heads, repaired with my own tired hands after storms. Vacations I never took, so they could have everything they wanted. Every sacrifice came rushing back, pressing down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. And for what? To be lied to be shut out of my own family's table, to be treated as though I didn't matter. I don't know how long I stood there. The laughter inside grew louder, crueler, like a chorus of betrayal. I wanted to burst in, slam my fists on the table, demand answers, but instead I backed away into the shadows. My feet carried me down the hall, past the pictures, past the echoes of a life I thought was built on love. My heart pounded, not just with pain, but with a strange clarity. Something inside me shifted that night. I realized this wasn't just about a canceled dinner. It was about years of being overlooked, dismissed, and used. It was about finally seeing the truth in one devastating instant. That was the night everything changed. That was the night my silence ended. They thought they had cut me out for good, but they had only lit the fire that would burn away their illusions. I have worked my entire life with one purpose in mind: to build something lasting for my family, something they could lean on, something that would shield them from the hardships I had endured in my own youth. And when I look back over the decades, I see nothing but sacrifice layered on top of sacrifice, the kind that is so constant it becomes invisible to those who benefit from it the most. I remember the early years, the mornings that began before sunrise, my body aching from yesterday's labor, but my resolve stronger than my fatigue, pushing myself to provide a roof, food, and stability, because I swore I would never allow my children to feel the kind of uncertainty I had once felt. Every paycheck was stretched to its breaking point, not for luxuries for myself, but to cover tuition, braces, new clothes, sports equipment, birthday gifts, and every other request that arrived with the innocent expectation that I could handle it. And I did, quietly, steadily, without ever once asking for thanks. When the house needed building, it was my hands that carried the lumber, my sweat that soaked into the soil beneath the foundation, my back that bent and strained until the structure stood tall enough to hold us all. I poured not only money but years of labor into that home, fixing every leak, repairing every creak, making sure the walls were strong enough to outlast storms, both weather and otherwise, because I wanted my children to always feel safe. When vacations were planned, I was the one who stayed behind, working extra shifts, taking overtime, so that my wife and kids could enjoy themselves, and when they came back with smiles and stories, I pretended not to notice that I had been left out, content only with the joy on their faces, telling myself that was reward enough. I can still recall nights when I sat up at the kitchen table, bank statements spread before me, my eyes burning with exhaustion as I figured out how to cover tuition fees, how to afford Christmas presents, how to pay medical bills without falling behind, never once considering cutting corners on their needs, even if it meant cutting corners on my own. My clothes were patched and worn, my shoes lasted years longer than they should have, my own dreams deferred so that theirs could take shape. And yet, through it all, I never complained, because I believed that sacrifice was the language of love, that they would understand it one day, that they would look back and realize everything they had came from the quiet endurance of a man who put them before himself. Every time I worked late, every time I missed a gathering because I was covering someone else's shift, every time I came home too tired to speak but still managed to smile, it was for them. The truth is, my life was not my own. It was theirs, handed over willingly, carved into pieces and given away to ensure their happiness, and I accepted that role, convinced it was noble, convinced it would bind us together in gratitude. And yet, when I stood there watching them eat without me, the cruelest part of the betrayal was not just the lie. It was the realization that all those sacrifices had been taken for granted, absorbed without acknowledgement, consumed without thought, as if my efforts were nothing more than air, unseen and unappreciated. The dinners I skipped so they could eat better, the hobbies I abandoned so they could chase theirs, the years of toil that bent my body into something stiff and weary, all of it had been forgotten the moment it was convenient to cast me aside. I gave everything I had, every ounce of energy, every scrap of hope, every heartbeat of labor, and in return, I was given silence, dismissal, and exclusion. They saw the results of my sacrifice every day in the comfort of the home, the opportunities they enjoyed, the security they took for granted, but they never saw me, not truly, not as the man who had built it all. And that truth, when it settled in my chest, became heavier than any burden I had ever carried in those long decades of work. The distance did not appear all at once. It crept in quietly like a slow fog that dulled the edges of what once felt sharp and warm, and I only realized how far it had spread when the damage was already done. I remember when my words used to carry weight, when my children would look to me with eyes full of trust, when even my smallest suggestions mattered, but those moments faded over the years until I found myself speaking into silence. At first it was subtle, the quick exchanges of glances between them when I spoke, the way their replies were short and clipped, as though indulging me out of obligation rather than interest. I would sit at the table, offer a story from work or a memory from my own childhood, and I would watch their eyes glaze over, my voice drowned out by the buzz of phones or side conversations. Once, my daughter asked me for advice about her job interview, and I stayed up late practicing answers with her. Yet when she got the position, she thanked her friends for their help and never once mentioned my name. My son, too, began to treat me like an accessory rather than a father. He would introduce me to his colleagues as if I were some relic of another time, barely worthy of more than a nod. And when I corrected him gently on small details, he would laugh dismissively, as though my knowledge was outdated and useless. Even my wife, who once leaned on me in everything, started to bypass me, making decisions without a word, informing me after the fact as though I were a guest in my own home. The slights grew sharper with time. I noticed my chair being shifted further from the center of the table, my place in conversation shrinking until I became little more than a shadow on the edge of their lives. They began to mock my habits, the way I liked to fix things by hand, the way I held on to old tools and traditions, calling me stubborn and outdated, never seeing that those very habits had kept us afloat all these years. Once, during a family gathering, my son joked loudly about how I should finally retire and let the younger ones handle things. And the laughter that followed cut deeper than any insult, because it told me they all agreed. My sacrifices had not earned me respect. They had rendered me invisible, my identity reduced to a wallet, a handyman, a silent figure who kept the lights on while the real living was done by others. There were times I tried to bridge the gap, to reach across that growing chasm. I offered to take them on trips, suggested we spend holidays together, but excuses always arrived: too busy, too tired, other plans. I noticed how invitations to social events excluded me, how photographs were taken without me, how moments were shared online while I lingered in the background unseen. And still I convinced myself it was temporary, that it was just the busyness of life, that surely they still valued me. But the truth was, little by little, they were erasing me, rewriting me from father and husband into something closer to an afterthought. I became the man who fixed the leaky faucet, who paid the bills without complaint, who filled the pantry but was never asked what he wanted to eat. And the cruelest part of it all was how normal it became, how easily they accepted my silence as part of the background, as if I had never been anything else. The distance did not explode into being, it was built brick by brick, slight by slight, until the wall stood tall between us and I was left staring at it, wondering when exactly I had disappeared from my own family's heart. That night is carved into my memory with a cruelty I cannot shake, as vivid as if it happened only moments ago, because it was not simply about being lied to. It was about seeing with my own eyes just how far I had been pushed out of their lives. I remember the phone call clearly, my son's voice flat and dismissive, telling me that dinner was canceled, that there was no point in me coming down, and though his tone carried the sharp edge of irritation, I tried to brush it off, convincing myself he was tired or stressed. I sat in my chair after the call, staring at the wall, something gnawing at my gut, whispering that something was wrong. The silence of the house felt too heavy, too staged, and though I had no reason to disbelieve my own flesh and blood, I found my feet moving, carrying me down the hall toward the kitchen, each step a battle between dread and hope. And then I heard it, faint at first, then undeniable, the unmistakable sound of laughter, forks against plates, voices raised in warmth and cheer. My heart stuttered, my breath caught in my throat. I stood frozen for a moment, telling myself it couldn't be, that my son had said dinner was canceled, that maybe it was the television or the neighbors, but deep down I knew before I even reached the doorway. When I turned the corner and looked through the frame, the sight before me confirmed every fear. The table was full, overflowing with food I had helped pay for, food that should have been shared with me, yet there they sat without me, my wife, my son, my daughter-in-law, even the grandchildren, plates piled high, glasses raised, faces glowing with contentment. My chair, the one that had always been mine, was gone, pushed against the wall like an unwanted guest, a silent reminder that I had not been expected, that I was not wanted. I stood there in the dim light of the hallway, watching them through the faint crack of the door, and the sound of their laughter was not joyous to me. It was a chorus of betrayal, every chuckle a knife, every smile a confirmation that I had been deliberately excluded. I looked at my son, the same son I had carried on my shoulders when he was small, the same boy I had stayed up late tutoring, the same young man whose every need I had met without complaint, and now he was leaning back in his chair, smirking at some private joke, his lies still fresh in my ear. My wife lifted her glass, toasting something I could not hear, and I realized that even she had chosen this, that she too had agreed I was no longer part of the picture. It was not an accident, not a misunderstanding. It was intentional, a decision made without me, against me. My stomach twisted with humiliation as I remembered his voice on the phone, calm and casual as he canceled me out of their evening, as if I were a trivial appointment that no longer mattered. I felt my body stiffen, my throat tighten, my eyes burn with the weight of 1,000 unspoken words. How easy it had been for them to laugh while I stood in the shadows, unseen, discarded like a broken tool that had served its purpose. I wanted to storm in, to demand answers, to force them to face the cruelty of what they had done, but instead I remained still, watching, absorbing the truth that stared back at me through that bright, mocking scene. In that moment, I was not a father, not a husband, not even a man in their eyes. I was nothing, invisible, erased. The food on their plates, the roof over their heads, the very walls that surrounded them had come from my hands, yet they had chosen to exclude the builder, the provider, the man who had made it all possible. The laughter behind that window echoed in my ears long after I turned away. And it was no longer the laughter of family. It was the sound of betrayal ringing in my bones, a cruel reminder that I had been pushed aside not by strangers, but by the very people I had given my life to. That was the night I finally understood that my place at their table had been taken away, and with it, the illusion that I still mattered to them. After that night I withdrew into myself, carrying the weight of silence like an anchor around my chest, testing each breath I took as I watched the people I once called family move around me with a coldness that felt sharper than open cruelty. They no longer had to lie about dinner because the exclusion had already been done, the message already delivered, and in the days that followed I began to notice the smaller details, the subtler ways in which they made it clear I was no longer part of their circle. Conversations that once filled the house with noise seemed to stop whenever I entered the room, as though my presence disrupted their rhythm, and when they did speak to me it was with short, clipped words, the bare minimum needed to acknowledge I existed. Eye contact became a rare commodity, their gazes slipping past me like I was an unwelcome shadow. And when our eyes did meet, there was always a flicker of impatience, a tightness around their mouths, as if even holding my gaze for too long was a burden. I began to measure my days by those looks, the size too soft to be called outright disrespect, but heavy enough to bruise, the hurried tone of their voices when I asked a question, the way my wife's replies had turned into statements meant to close the conversation rather than open it. I noticed how they no longer waited for me at the table, how they served themselves quickly and left me to scrape what was left, how the grandchildren avoided sitting beside me, their parents nudging them toward other seats, as though my presence carried some quiet shame. Even in the smallest routines, the rejection lingered. When I tried to help around the house, fixing something or offering advice, my efforts were met with irritation, as if my contribution was an intrusion, my suggestions outdated and unnecessary. I found myself retreating more often into the solitude of my room, listening to their voices from behind closed doors, the warmth of family life continuing without me. The silence I carried was not peace. It was suffocation, the kind that presses against your ribs until every breath feels borrowed. I began to speak less, not because I had nothing to say, but because I had learned that my words would not be heard. Each attempt at conversation became a lesson in futility, each dismissal a reminder that I had been reduced to something less than a participant in their lives. It was as though I had become a ghost haunting my own home, drifting quietly through hallways where laughter once welcomed me, now only met with silence or the faint rustle of annoyance. What struck me most was how natural it all seemed to them, how easily they had adapted to treating me this way, as though my absence from their affection had been rehearsed for years. I carried their avoidance like a cloak, invisible yet suffocating, a reminder that I was tolerated but not loved, present but not wanted. And yet, even in that heavy silence, a seed began to grow, a thought that perhaps my quiet endurance had been my greatest mistake, that by giving them all of me without demand, I had taught them that I required nothing in return. That silence became my companion, and though it wounded me, it also sharpened me, teaching me to see clearly the truth I had ignored for too long. It was late one evening when the truth finally revealed itself in a way that stripped away every last shred of illusion I had been clinging to, and though part of me had long suspected it, hearing it spoken aloud by the very mouths of my own family was a wound deeper than any I had endured before. I had gone to bed early, or at least I pretended to, lying still in the dark while the sounds of conversation drifted up from the living room, and at first I tried to ignore it, to let their voices become nothing more than background noise. But then I heard my name spoken, followed by a wave of laughter that froze me where I lay. My son's voice was the loudest, dripping with arrogance as he called me useless, saying I had outlived my purpose, that all I was good for now was paying bills and fixing things until the day I finally keeled over. My wife laughed at the remark, a sharp, cold sound that did not belong to the woman I had once loved, and she muttered something about how I had become an obstacle rather than a partner, someone who held resources they needed, but no longer someone they respected. I remember holding my breath, straining to catch every word as my daughter-in-law chimed in, suggesting it was time to convince me to sign over more of my accounts, to start shifting the property into their names so that when the inevitable happened, they wouldn't have to fight for control. The word inevitable cut through me like a knife. To them, I was already gone, a fading figure whose worth was measured only in deeds, savings, and assets, not in love or loyalty. My son went on, mocking the way I still repaired things with my hands, saying it was pathetic how I clung to old habits instead of letting them hire someone modern. And my wife agreed, saying I was stuck in the past, too stubborn to adapt, too blind to see how little I mattered anymore. Their laughter overlapped, each voice blending into a cruel chorus, tearing at the very core of who I was, and I felt my chest tighten, my fists clench under the blanket as the truth settled over me like a crushing weight. It was not just neglect, not just distance. They despised me, saw me as a relic to be managed until I could be discarded, a gatekeeper to resources they believed already belonged to them. I lay there in the darkness, my heart pounding, my breath shallow, and every memory of sacrifice flooded back. Every shift I had worked, every meal I had skipped, every sleepless night, planning for their futures, and all of it had led to this moment where they reduced me to nothing but a stumbling block in the way of their greed. I wanted to storm downstairs, to confront them, to scream that I had heard every word, but I remained still, listening until the conversation drifted into other topics, their laughter still echoing in my ears. In that silence after, when their voices had faded and the house was still, I stared at the ceiling, and for the first time in my life, the love I had poured into them felt dead, replaced by something harder, colder, and sharper. The truth had finally stripped away every excuse I had made for them, every hope that they might change, and in its place came a clarity I had never known before. They thought I was useless. They thought I was blind. They thought I was already finished. But what they had truly done was awaken a resolve in me they had never imagined I possessed. I lay awake that night staring at the ceiling, the echo of their laughter still rattling in my ears, and something inside me shifted with a finality I cannot fully describe, as if the man who had carried sorrow like a burden for years simply dissolved and left behind someone colder, sharper, more dangerous. For so long I had swallowed the pain, convinced myself that patience was strength, that silence was dignity, but in truth, my silence had only taught them contempt. It had convinced them I was weak, that I would endure anything they did without protest, and as I turned their words over in my mind, useless, outdated, an obstacle, I realized the mistake had been mine. They thought they had me cornered. They thought they could chip away at me until I simply faded into nothing. But what they did not understand was that I had not survived this long by being fragile. Every sacrifice I had made, every hardship I had endured, had forged me into something resilient, something capable of far more than they ever imagined. And the cruel irony was that in dismissing me, they had given me the greatest weapon of all, being underestimated. I no longer felt the ache of betrayal in the same way, no longer felt the sting of their rejection like fresh wounds. Instead, I felt heat building low in my chest, not the fire of anger that burns wild and out of control, but the steady burn of resolve, a controlled flame that would not go out until justice was done. I thought about the years I had spent working with my hands, budgeting every coin, finding solutions when there seemed to be none, and I realized that same endurance and skill could be turned toward something else, something they would never see coming. I remembered my son's smirk, my wife's cold laugh, my daughter-in-law's calculating tone, and instead of sorrow, I felt an almost chilling calm settle over me. Let them laugh. Let them believe I am blind and frail, because every word they have spoken has only hardened me. I had given them my love, and they had thrown it back in my face. I had given them my devotion, and they had mocked me for it. But now I would give them something else, something they could neither mock nor escape. They mistook my silence for weakness, but silence is not weakness. Silence is preparation. It is observation. It is the gathering of strength. And in that moment, staring at the ceiling while their betrayal replayed in my mind, I knew I would no longer simply endure. I would act. I would reclaim what was mine. And I would make sure that the family who had dismissed me as useless would learn exactly how dangerous a silent man can be once he has nothing left to lose. The next morning I rose with the same quiet demeanor they had always known, but beneath that stillness, something new had taken root, something steady and unyielding, and while they continued to treat me as if I were invisible, I began the work of ensuring that their arrogance would become their downfall. I started with the small things, keeping a notebook hidden in my drawer where I documented every conversation, every insult, every careless remark they let slip when they thought I wasn't listening. Dates, times, exact words, all written down with the meticulous precision of a man who had spent his life solving problems through detail and patience. I dug through old files and unearthed financial records that I had stored away for years, reviewing every account, every transaction, reminding myself where the power truly lay. The home they lived in so comfortably, the savings they assumed would one day be theirs, the assets they had already begun to discuss dividing among themselves, all of it bore my name, all of it was held in place because of me. And for the first time in years, I felt the strength of that truth. Property deeds that I had once considered simply papers of responsibility now became weapons, proof of ownership that they had overlooked in their haste to count me out. I made copies of everything, storing them in secure places they would never think to look, and as I did so, I felt my resolve harden. They saw me as a relic, as a man too old to understand how the world works, but they had forgotten that I was the one who built the foundation they stood on, and I had never forgotten how to protect what was mine. I began listening more closely during their conversations, pretending to be distracted while my ears caught every careless scheme, and each time they revealed more of their intentions, I wrote it down, piece by piece, creating a record of their betrayal so thorough it could stand in any court, so undeniable it would strip them of the lies they hid behind. I moved through the house with the same quiet steps, but now every action was deliberate, every moment an opportunity to gather evidence, and though they believed my silence was the silence of defeat, it was, in truth, the silence of preparation. At night I sat at my desk, reviewing what I had collected, drawing lines between the patterns, and for the first time in a long time, I did not feel powerless. I felt strong. Not in the way of youth or brute force, but in the way of a man who has nothing left to fear and everything left to protect. My hidden strength was not in confrontation or noise, it was in method, in strategy, in patience, and as I continued my work, the weight of sorrow that had once crushed me began to lift, replaced by the steady confidence of a man who knew he held the truth, the proof, and the means to turn the tables on those who had underestimated him. They thought they were preparing for my absence, planning for a future without me, but it was I who was preparing for theirs, and with every record filed, every note written, I built the foundation of a plan that would ensure their greed would collapse beneath them. I walked into the lawyer's office with the same quiet composure my family had grown used to, but inside me was the weight of years and the sharp edge of a new determination. And as I sat across from the man I had chosen to trust, I laid out everything I had gathered, the documents, the deeds, the records of conversations that revealed my family's disdain. He listened carefully, his eyes scanning the papers with the practiced calm of someone who had seen families torn apart by greed before. And when he finally looked up at me, his voice was steady and reassuring as he told me what I had almost forgotten, that all those years of sacrifice, all the labor and discipline, had not left me powerless, as my family believed, but had in fact left me with far more control than they could ever imagine. He explained the legal weight of the deeds in my name, the savings accounts I alone had authority over, the will that remained mine to shape. And as he spoke, a strange relief began to settle over me, a realization that the empire they thought they had already claimed was still firmly mine. He told me I had every right to restructure my will, to place protections on my assets, to ensure that those who mocked me as useless would never touch what they had not earned. He pointed out how vulnerable they truly were, how their arrogance had blinded them to the fact that they depended on me entirely, that without my signature, without my compliance, they had nothing. Every line of legal language he translated into plain terms became another stone added to the wall of my resolve, each piece of advice a weapon I could wield without ever raising my voice. He spoke of trusts, of transfers, of safeguards that could place my property beyond their reach, and he promised that if I wanted to act, it could all be arranged quietly, methodically, leaving them unaware until it was too late. I remember nodding slowly, the pieces of my life rearranging themselves in my mind, the sorrow that had weighed me down now transforming into something sharper, a kind of grim satisfaction that after everything, I still held the reins. The lawyer looked at me, perhaps expecting to see a broken old man desperate for rescue, but what he saw instead was someone who had been underestimated for far too long and who now understood the depth of his own power. He assured me that I was not alone in this, that professionals like him existed to ensure men like me were not stripped of what was rightfully theirs, and his words felt like validation, like the universe itself had finally confirmed what I had known deep inside, that my sacrifices had not been in vain, that I had built more than just a family. I had built security, authority, and ownership that no amount of greed could erase. As I left his office with folders of paperwork tucked under my arm, I felt lighter than I had in years, not because the pain was gone, but because for the first time since the betrayal began, I could see the path forward, a clear route to justice that would not rely on shouting matches or desperate pleas, but on the quiet, calculated strength of law and truth. My family thought my silence meant defeat, but with allies like this lawyer by my side, my silence had become something else entirely, the silence before the storm they would never see coming. I returned home from the lawyer's office with a new fire burning inside me, and though on the surface I remained the same quiet figure my family believed they could dismiss, inside my mind a plan was already taking shape, precise and unrelenting, a strategy built not on impulse but on careful thought and methodical preparation. The first step was the will. The document they had been so certain was already theirs to benefit from, and I began the process of rewriting it completely, stripping away the assumptions they had built their greed upon. With the lawyer's guidance, I redirected my assets into a trust that they could not touch, securing every property, every account, every last investment in ways that would bypass their grasping hands and land instead where I chose. No longer would my home be promised to the son who mocked me. No longer would my savings be fodder for my wife's disdainful laughter or my daughter-in-law's manipulations. Instead, the fruits of my life's labor would be safeguarded, placed under the stewardship of people and institutions who understood respect, who would see my sacrifices for what they were worth. Next came the property. The house they all lived in so comfortably, the walls they filled with laughter while excluding me from the table. That home had been built by my hands, funded by my sweat, and though they took it for granted as theirs, it remained under my name, my control, and with a few signatures, it could be shifted into protection that placed it far beyond their reach. The lawyer showed me how to separate ownership, how to ensure that when the time came, they would find themselves shut out of the very security they believed belonged to them by right. Then came the finances, the accounts they whispered about late at night, the numbers they dreamed of claiming. One by one, I secured them, moving funds, creating safeguards, ensuring that their plans to slowly bleed me dry would crumble the moment they tried. Each step of the plan was like laying bricks, constructing a wall they could not scale, and with every action I felt the sorrow in my chest give way to a kind of grim anticipation. They had mocked me, dismissed me, called me useless, but with every line of legal protection, with every signature on a document they would never see coming, I turned their arrogance into the very trap that would undo them. My strategy was not built on anger, but on clarity. I knew their greed, I knew their sense of entitlement, and I would use it against them, letting them continue to believe I was powerless, all the while tightening the net around them. They would not know until the day arrived that their future had already been rewritten, that the wealth and security they had counted on had been pulled from beneath their feet, that their cruelty had cost them everything they thought they had won. And as I sat at my desk late into the night, the papers spread before me, I no longer felt like the invisible man haunting the corners of his own home. I felt like a builder again, shaping something lasting, but this time it was not for them. This time it was for me, for my dignity, for justice, and for the satisfaction of knowing that their greed would one day crush them beneath its own weight, leaving me finally free of the chains of sacrifice they had twisted into scorn. I slipped back into the role they had written for me, the quiet old man shuffling through the house with lowered eyes and slow steps, and while they congratulated themselves on their control, I was busy layering the foundations of my plan beneath the surface of that performance. At breakfast I nodded absently to their curt remarks, spooning food into my mouth without protest, as though I were too dull to notice the way they avoided speaking to me directly, and when they sighed at my questions or waved off my suggestions, I lowered my head in silence, letting them believe I had accepted my place as irrelevant. I fixed the faucet when it leaked, repaired the door when it squeaked, mowed the lawn when it grew long, never drawing attention to myself, never offering more words than necessary, and in their eyes I remained the same invisible provider who existed only to keep the house standing. What they never suspected was that every night after the chores were done and they retreated into their comfortable world, I withdrew into my own space and deepened my preparations, sorting through documents, securing accounts, tightening the web of protection that now encircled everything they once thought was theirs. I let them laugh, let them boast about the future they believed awaited them, because their arrogance was the perfect cover for my work. They whispered in corners about how I was fading, how it was only a matter of time before they assumed full control, and I nodded along when I overheard fragments of these conversations, my face blank, my hands folded, the very image of compliance. Inside, however, my mind was sharp, tracking every word, filing away every careless detail they revealed about their schemes, each piece fitting neatly into the record I had been building. The lawyer called occasionally, and I would step outside with the phone pressed tightly to my ear, speaking in the low, deliberate voice of a man who could not afford to be overheard, finalizing trusts, confirming transfers, ensuring the fortress of my protections grew higher with each passing week. They never noticed the subtle changes, the locked drawers, the sealed envelopes, the folders that disappeared from the shelves, for in their minds I was incapable of anything so deliberate. They mistook my silence for surrender, and that mistake allowed me to move freely, unchallenged, beneath their gaze. Even when I looked at my son across the dinner table, his smile smug, his words dripping with the casual arrogance of someone who believed he had already won, I offered nothing in return but the tired nod of a man too weary to fight. My wife spoke to me less and less, her tone sharp when she did, and I responded with soft replies that carried no hint of defiance. They never once paused to wonder if the silence they mocked might conceal something else. And that blindness was my greatest weapon. I wore the mask they had given me with such convincing ease that even I began to marvel at how easily they were deceived, and all the while the plan grew stronger, more complete. They thought they were waiting for me to fade, but in truth I was waiting for them, biding my time, sharpening the edge of my retribution until the moment it would finally cut clean through the web of their greed. It was during one of my late nights of sorting through records that the deeper betrayal revealed itself, not in careless words or mocking laughter, but in the cold numbers and ink of financial statements, numbers that did not add up, transactions that did not belong to me, signatures that looked eerily similar to mine but were not mine. At first I thought it was a mistake, perhaps an error from the bank, but as I traced the documents further, I found patterns, debts that had been opened in my name, credit cards with balances I had never touched, loans that carried my information but none of my authorization. The realization came slowly, like a sickness spreading through my chest, that my children had not only dismissed me as useless, but had actively tried to bury me beneath the weight of their recklessness. My son had spoken so casually about how I was old-fashioned, how I clung to outdated habits, yet here were accounts in my name funding vacations, purchases, luxuries that he and his wife had enjoyed without hesitation. My daughter, too, had dipped her hand into the well, using my information to cover debts she had hidden from her husband, debts that now rested precariously under the guise of my responsibility. I stared at those papers for hours, my jaw clenched, the betrayal burning hotter with every line of numbers that spelled out how deep their manipulation had gone. It was not enough for them to mock me, not enough to exclude me. They had sought to hollow out the very foundation of what I had built, to drain my future so that theirs could remain comfortable. I thought of every hour I had worked, every dollar I had saved, every moment of my life spent ensuring they would never know the hunger or fear I had once known, and here they were, using my name like a tool, shackling me with chains of debt I had never chosen. The weight of it pressed down on me until I could hardly breathe, but beneath that weight was something else too, a cold fury that sharpened my resolve even further. I gathered every document, every receipt, every fraudulent signature, and I filed them carefully into my growing record, the proof of their greed now undeniable. The lawyer's words came back to me then that I held far more control than they realized, and as I looked at the evidence, I understood the truth. While they believed they were burying me, they had, in fact, dug their own graves. And all I had to do was reveal what they had done. They thought they were clever, that their deception would remain hidden under the assumption that I was too old, too naive to see it. But what they failed to understand was that I had spent a lifetime scrutinizing every detail, balancing every account, ensuring survival through precision and discipline, and now that same discipline had uncovered the rot they had tried to conceal. Their manipulation ran deeper than I had ever imagined, but so too did my determination, and with every debt I uncovered, with every fraudulent account exposed, my plan grew not only stronger, but more righteous. They had not only betrayed me as a father, they had betrayed me as a man, reducing me to a pawn in their schemes, and for that, the justice I would deliver would be merciless. The turning point came quietly, without spectacle, without the dramatic outburst my family might have expected if they had known what I was doing, and that was precisely what made it so effective. With my lawyer's guidance, I began securing every corner of my financial life, sealing off vulnerabilities, closing gaps, and shifting everything of value into channels they would never be able to touch. The accounts they thought they had access to were restructured, locked with protections that required only my signature and authority, and I moved what mattered most into holdings they would never be able to trace, trusts bound by legal steel, investments held in names and structures beyond their comprehension. The house they lived in so confidently, the one they assumed would fall neatly into their hands, was no longer theirs to covet, for with a few quiet signatures and notarized documents, it was placed into a protective trust, its future secured in ways that bypassed them entirely. The lawyer watched me work with a kind of measured respect, guiding me through each decision, ensuring that every move was not only lawful but ironclad, and together we built a fortress that even their most desperate scheming could not breach. Properties that had once been theirs in their imagination were quietly sold, the proceeds redirected into safe accounts, their dreams of inheritance dissolving with every signature I placed on a page. I walked through those transactions with the same calm they mistook for weakness, but inside I felt a growing strength, a clarity that for the first time in years gave me peace. Each sale, each transfer, each safeguard was a stone laid in the wall between myself and their greed, and with every brick I felt lighter, as though the years of sacrifice that had once chained me to their entitlement were finally being reclaimed. They noticed nothing, of course. My mask of silence remained firmly in place, and they went on mocking me, sighing at my presence, laughing at my supposed irrelevance, never realizing that the foundation of their imagined future was crumbling beneath them. My son spoke carelessly about how one day the house would be his, and I bit my tongue to keep from smiling, knowing full well it already slipped beyond his grasp. My wife glanced at the mailbox with indifference, never suspecting that inside were letters confirming sales, transfers, protections she would never understand. The tide was turning, not with noise or confrontation, but with the quiet power of preparation, and the irony was not lost on me while they mocked my silence. It was that very silence that now sheltered the storm gathering against them. By the time they would realize what I had done, it would be far too late. The wealth they thought belonged to them already moved, already locked away, already transformed into something they could not reach. And in those moments, as I signed each paper and sealed each deal, I felt the truth settle firmly in my heart. I was no longer their victim, no longer the silent man in the shadows. I was the architect of their downfall, and the tide that had once carried me toward despair was now carrying them toward the reckoning they had earned. I began to let the smallest cracks show, not enough to reveal the depth of what I was doing, but just enough to plant doubt in their minds, a subtle shift in the way I carried myself, a glimmer in my eyes when they expected only emptiness. At dinner, when my son made his usual jokes about how one day the house would be his, I looked at him a moment longer than usual, let a faint smile touch my lips, and said quietly, "You shouldn't be too sure of that." The words were soft, almost casual, but I saw the flicker in his expression, the brief hesitation before he forced a laugh, as though he wasn't certain whether I meant it as a joke or something else entirely. My wife once mentioned in passing how she hoped the savings would cover the grandchildren's future, and instead of my usual silent nod, I replied, "The future is already taken care of, though maybe not in the way you think." She frowned at that, her fork pausing halfway to her mouth, but I offered nothing more, returning to my meal with calm indifference. Even my daughter-in-law, who had always spoken to me with veiled condescension, seemed unsettled one evening when she asked if I had updated my will, and I told her with a steady gaze, "Every detail has been seen to. There will be no surprises for me." She forced a smile, but I could see the discomfort in her eyes. These were not outbursts, not confrontations, but seeds, small, deliberate hints that something was happening beyond their sight, and the more I offered, the more I watched unease creep into their arrogance. I noticed the way conversations sometimes faltered when I entered the room, the way my son would study me as though trying to gauge whether I knew more than he let on, the way my wife began to ask small, probing questions about the mail, the bank, the lawyer I claimed to be meeting for, insurance matters. I gave them nothing concrete, only fragments, looks, and carefully chosen words, and that was enough to rattle them. For the first time in years, the balance had shifted. No longer was I the silent ghost lingering in the background. I had become something else in their eyes, unpredictable, unreadable, a man they could not fully control. And the irony was that my calm demeanor, the very thing they had once mocked, now unnerved them, because beneath that calm they sensed something moving, something they could not name. I let them wonder, let them lie awake imagining what I might be doing, and in that uncertainty their confidence began to crack, and it was in those cracks that my retribution would one day take root. It happened one evening when the air in the house felt heavy with their expectation, the kind of tension that comes before a demand, and sure enough, my son and daughter cornered me in the living room, their voices sharp and impatient as they laid out what they wanted. They spoke not with humility or respect, but with the practiced entitlement of people who had convinced themselves they were owed, telling me there was a bill that needed covering, a new expense that had to be handled, and that, of course, I would provide the money, as I always had. My son leaned forward, his tone dripping with arrogance, saying it was my duty that after everything he had done to help me out, I should at least make things easier for him, while my daughter chimed in, her voice shrill with indignation, insisting that I sign over some of the funds immediately. In the past, I would have complied, gritting my teeth and convincing myself that giving was easier than fighting. But this time, I sat still, my hands folded in my lap, and I said a single word they had never expected to hear from me, no. The silence that followed was louder than any shout. They blinked, caught off guard, as though their ears had betrayed them, and then the outrage came pouring out. My son's face twisted in disbelief as he barked that I had no right to withhold what was his, that everything I owned was only temporary until he took his rightful place. My daughter spat cruel words, calling me selfish, accusing me of abandoning them after all they had done, her tone dripping with contempt. They hurled insult after insult, each one meant to provoke me, to force me into backing down as I always had, but I did not flinch. I sat there calmly, my gaze steady, letting their rage wash over me like a storm against stone. Every word they spat only confirmed the truth I had already uncovered, that their love was nothing but greed in disguise, that their loyalty had never existed at all. And as they raged, I felt no sorrow, only a strange and powerful calm. The calm of a man who had already secured his defenses, who had already shifted the battlefield beyond their reach. My refusal was not just about that money. It was about reclaiming myself, about showing them that the weak old man they thought they controlled no longer existed. When they demanded explanations, I gave them none. When they accused me of betrayal, I simply replied, "I do not owe you what you have not earned." My voice was steady, low, and final, and for the first time I saw real fear flicker in their eyes, because they realized something had changed, something they could not name, and their insults suddenly rang hollow in the face of my composure. They stormed out eventually, slamming doors, muttering curses, their arrogance bruised, their confidence shaken, and I remained where I was, calm and unshaken, knowing that the first strike had been made. They had demanded, I had refused, and nothing in their world would ever be the same again. The gathering had been arranged by them, not by me, a carefully staged event where they believed they would corner me once again, pressing me into a corner with their demands and their smug certainty that I could no longer resist. But I walked into that room knowing this would be the day everything changed, the day masks fell and truths were laid bare. They were all there. My son with his inflated confidence, my daughter-in-law clinging to him like a vulture waiting to feast, my daughter with her impatient eyes already scanning me as though I were a check waiting to be signed, and my wife, who had long since chosen silence in the face of their cruelty, now sitting at the head of the table as though she presided over my slow erasure. They spoke to me with forced sweetness, offering hollow words about family and unity, but beneath the surface I could hear the sharp edge of expectation, the hunger in their voices as they circled around the topic they had gathered for. When my son finally cleared his throat and said it was time, I made everything official, time to sign over accounts and property so they could manage things responsibly. I let the silence linger just long enough for their smiles to tighten before I placed the thick folder on the table in front of me. Their eyes followed it greedily, thinking it was the documentation of their triumph, but as I opened it and began to speak, the expressions on their faces began to shift. I told them calmly, steadily, that the assets they had counted on no longer lay within their grasp, that the accounts had been secured, redirected, placed in trusts that bypassed them entirely. I told them the house they were sitting in, the one they had so arrogantly assumed would be theirs, had already been placed beyond their reach, its future sealed in ways they could not undo. Their laughter faltered then, their smugness cracking as they realized the ground beneath them was shifting. My son tried to interrupt, his voice rising with anger, but I cut him off with a calm firmness that left no room for argument, pulling out the records I had gathered, the evidence of their debts, the fraudulent signatures, the plans they had spoken of in their careless cruelty. I laid each piece on the table like a weapon, and with each revelation their faces grew paler, their arrogance slipping away until only shock remained. I told them I had heard every word, every insult, every plan to strip me of what I had built, and that all of it was documented, prepared, and protected. They had called me useless, irrelevant, blind, But in that moment, they saw the truth that I had been watching, listening, planning, and that their schemes had only tightened the trap they now found themselves in. My wife's hand trembled as she tried to protest, but I fixed her with the same calm gaze and said, "The days of taking from me are over. You will get nothing you have not earned." My son shouted then, pounding the table, his arrogance collapsing into rage, but even in his fury, he knew it was too late. I had already acted, already secured everything, and their realization was written in the silence that followed his outburst. I gathered the folder back into my hands, my heart steady, my voice calm as I told them the truth they could no longer ignore while they had mocked my silence. I had been building their downfall. The reveal was complete, their greed laid bare, their manipulation exposed, and for the first time in years I felt the weight lift from my shoulders, replaced by the undeniable strength of vindication. They thought they had orchestrated my end, but in truth, I had orchestrated theirs. The room erupted, like a storm breaking without warning, their fury and disbelief crashing against me in waves, but I stood calm in the eye of it, watching as the family I had once sacrificed everything for revealed the true depth of their greed and panic. My son was the loudest, his face red, his voice booming as he accused me of betrayal, his words tumbling over each other in a mixture of anger and desperation. He shouted that I had no right, that everything I owned was his by birthright, that I had stolen from him what was already destined to be his, and he slammed his fist on the table so hard the glasses rattled. But his rage was nothing more than the tantrum of a man who had finally realized the foundation of his arrogance had crumbled. My daughter-in-law, her mask of polite superiority stripped away, shrieked about the sacrifices she had made to this family, demanding to know how I could humiliate them like this, her words spilling into incoherence as panic overtook her composure. My daughter sat frozen at first, her lips parted in shock, her eyes darting to the folder of documents as though she might still find some loophole to save her, but when she realized there was none, she broke into sobs, not of grief for me, not of remorse, but of fear for her own future, now that the wealth she had counted on had vanished before her eyes. Even my wife, who had for so long kept her silence, raised her voice against me for the first time in years, accusing me of cruelty, of turning against my own flesh and blood, her face contorted not with sorrow but with outrage that I had dared to step outside the role they had written for me. They hurled insult after insult, the words useless, selfish, senile, traitor cutting through the air, each one an attempt to drag me back into the cage I had once allowed them to build around me. But the insults no longer pierced. Instead, I watched with a strange calm as their composure unraveled, as their carefully constructed world collapsed in front of them, because in that chaos I saw the truth they could no longer deny. They had built their future on the assumption that I would remain silent and compliant, and now that silence had turned into their undoing. My son's voice cracked as he demanded to know what I had done with the accounts, his arrogance twisting into desperation when I told him simply that they were secured, untouchable, beyond his reach. My daughter-in-law clutched his arm, whispering frantically about lawyers, about ways to fight, but I could see the dread in her eyes as she realized that every step they might take would only expose their own deceit further. My daughter wept about the promises I had made, though I knew the only promise she mourned was the one she had written for herself, that my work and sacrifice would guarantee her comfort. The panic in the room was thick, their fury tangled with fear, their disbelief cracking into fragments of denial, but beneath it all was the dawning recognition that I had beaten them at their own game, that I had not been the weak old man they had dismissed, but the architect of their collapse. They raged and they wailed, their voices colliding in the air like shattered glass, but all I felt was a cold clarity, the satisfaction of watching them confront the consequences of their greed. Their future, once imagined as secure and effortless, had crumbled into dust before their eyes, and no amount of fury, disbelief, or panic could rebuild it. I had taken back what was mine, and in doing so, I had stripped them of everything they thought they had already won. I stood in the doorway of the house I had built with my own hands, the walls that had once echoed with laughter and warmth, now nothing more than hollow chambers that carried the residue of betrayal, and I realized that what once had been my sanctuary had turned into nothing but a monument to sacrifice, twisted by greed. The wood of the frame still carried the memory of my sweat. The foundation still bore the weight of the years I had spent providing, and yet as I looked upon it one final time, I felt no attachment, no yearning, because love no longer lived within those walls, only resentment and entitlement. My family had drained the spirit from this place, hollowed it until it stood not as a home, but as a reminder of their manipulation. And as much as I had once believed I would die within its walls, I now understood that walking away was not defeat, it was liberation. They watched me as I gathered my coat, their faces a mixture of rage, disbelief, and fear, waiting perhaps for me to crumble, to beg for reconciliation, to offer one last compromise to soothe the tension. But I gave them nothing. I walked slowly, deliberately, my steps steady with the weight of finality, and for once it was not my shoulders that sagged, but theirs. My son tried to speak, his voice rising with desperation, but I did not turn, and my wife called my name, the syllables empty, a reflex rather than a plea, and still I did not stop. For years I had bent myself to their demands, allowed myself to be diminished under the pretense of family, but in that moment every step I took toward the door was a reclamation of dignity, of power, of the self they had tried to erase. I paused only once, at the threshold, my hand resting on the frame that I had smoothed and painted decades earlier, and I whispered to myself, not to them, that this house was no longer mine. Not because I had lost it, but because I had outgrown it, because it had been corrupted beyond saving. Then I stepped outside, the air sharp and cool against my face, carrying none of the bitterness that lingered inside, and I closed the door behind me with a finality that echoed louder than any argument could. I walked away not as a man abandoned by his family, but as a man who had freed himself from the chains of their greed, and each step down that path felt lighter, stronger, as though the years of silence and humiliation had fallen from me at last. The house stood behind me, solid but empty, and I did not look back, because what I left there was not a home. It was betrayal carved into brick and timber. I walked away with power, not defeat, knowing that I had taken everything that mattered with me, my dignity, my strength, my resolve, and what remained behind was nothing but walls stripped of meaning. The silence that surrounded me after I left was unlike the silence I had carried for years inside that house. It was not heavy or suffocating. It was clear and unburdened, a stillness that gave me room to breathe for the first time in decades. I sat alone and thought of everything that had led me here, the betrayals, the lies, the laughter that had cut so deeply, and yet I did not feel bitterness clawing at me anymore. Instead, there was a deep, steady pride, the kind that comes from knowing you have faced cruelty and refused to let it define your end. For so long I had believed my silence was weakness, that my sacrifices had been wasted on a family that only saw me as a resource to drain, but now I understood that silence had been my greatest weapon, the shield that let me watch, listen, and plan until I was ready to strike. They had mocked me, called me useless, tried to strip me of what I had built, but in the end it was their greed that undid them and my resolve that secured justice. I thought of the house, of the years spent hammering nails into its beams, patching roofs, fixing pipes, and though I had walked away from it, I did not feel as though I had lost anything, because what mattered most was never the walls themselves. It was the dignity I carried in my heart, and that had been restored. The assets were secured, the deeds protected, the wealth beyond their reach. But more than that, the truth had been revealed, their cruelty exposed under the weight of their own arrogance. I no longer had to live wondering if they valued me, no longer had to hope for gratitude that would never come, because I had seen the truth and acted on it. And that action, that quiet and deliberate reclaiming of what was mine, had brought me a peace I had not known in years. I did not dream of revenge beyond what I had already done. I did not crave to see them suffer endlessly, because their suffering had already begun the moment they realized the future they thought was guaranteed had crumbled. What I carried now was not hatred but clarity. A sense of balance returned. Justice served without shouting or violence, only the steady hand of a man who had finally remembered his own worth. As I sat in the quiet, I let the weight of my victories settle into me, not the kind of victory measured in money or possessions, but the victory of knowing that I had not been defeated, that I had risen from their scorn and proven myself stronger than their betrayal. Pride filled the spaces where sorrow had once lived, and in that pride came peace. A peace built not on illusions of family that never existed, but on the truth of my own resilience. For the first time in years, I felt whole again, not as a provider, not as a victim, but as a man who had reclaimed his dignity and ensured that justice, at last, was served. Betrayal cut me deeper than any blade ever could. It stripped me bare, exposed every wound I had carried in silence, and for a time I believed it had destroyed me. But in truth it had done something far more powerful. It had given me clarity. For years I had lived blinded by love and sacrifice, convincing myself that patience was virtue and endurance was enough. But their cruelty tore away that illusion and forced me to see the truth of what I had become in their eyes. They thought they had reduced me to nothing, but in trying to erase me they revealed my strength, the resilience I had built over decades of labor and sacrifice. Their betrayal may have wounded me, but it also awakened me. It gave me the resolve to reclaim what was mine, and the courage to walk away from what no longer deserved me. I see now that my life was never theirs to control, never theirs to strip from me with lies and manipulation. I gave freely out of love. But when that love was twisted into entitlement, I found within myself the power to take it back. I stand now not as the man they mocked, not as the silent figure they dismissed, but as someone who endured, who rose, and who claimed victory without raising his voice, only by standing firm in truth. They will live with the weight of their greed, with the knowledge that everything they counted on slipped through their fingers because they mistook kindness for weakness. And I will live with peace, with the pride of knowing that I did not let betrayal define my end, but instead used it to forge a new beginning. Betrayal gave me clarity, and with that clarity I reclaimed my life, my dignity, and my freedom. And that is a truth no one can ever take from me again. Your time means a lot. Thank you for listening to my journey. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. To hear the next story, just click the box on the left.